The air in the school auditorium was thick with the smell of popcorn and cheap perfume, buzzing with the excited chatter of 100 conversations all happening at once. It was the annual talent show, the one night of the year where the school's rigid social structure seemed to melt away, replaced by a shared appreciation for singing, dancing, and the occasional magic trick. The stage lights bathed the room in a warm, hazy glow, making everything feel a little more important than it actually was. In the very center of it all, right in the front row, sat Rohan. He was like the king of this temporary kingdom, leaning back in his squeaky metal chair with an air of effortless confidence. People naturally gravitated towards him, laughing a little too loud at his jokes and hanging on his every word. He had a smile that could charm teachers out of homework, and a way of carrying himself that made him seem older, more in control than anyone else in the room. But there was an edge to his charm, a slight chill behind the warmth of his smile. He was the kind of person who could say something mean, but wrap it in so much humor that you almost felt bad for being offended. It was his specialty, a quiet power he wielded to keep everyone in their place, several rows back, in a spot that was deliberately chosen to be as far from the center of attention as possible. Said Anya. The bright lights of the stage felt harsh to her, and the constant noise made her shoulders tense up. She wasn't there for the show. A well-meaning teacher had practically pushed the ticket into her hand, insisting that it would be good for her to get out. So she came, but she brought her own world with her. Open on her lap was her sketchbook, its pages filled with intricate drawings of fantastical creatures in sprawling, imaginary cities. Her pencil moved softly across the page, a familiar and comforting motion that drowned out the noise around her. She was sketching a small, detailed dragon, its scales catching the light from the stage in a way that made it look almost real. For her, the talent show was just a noisy, colorful backdrop to the quiet world she was creating on paper. She was an expert at being invisible, at finding the small pockets of space where she could exist without being noticed. It was a skill she had perfected over years of feeling like she was on the outside looking in. Then, her eyes drifted up from her sketchbook, and for a moment they met his. Rohan was glancing back over the crowd, a quick, lazy scan of his kingdom, and his gaze passed right over her. Or maybe it didn't. For a split second, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a spark of something that wasn't just casual dismissal. A knot formed in her stomach. She knew Rohan, or at least she used to. Back in middle school, before he had grown into his confident persona and she had retreated further into her shell, they had been sort of friends. They had sat next to each other in science class, bonding over a shared dislike for dissecting frogs and a mutual love for a certain fantasy book series. He was a little awkward back then, with braces and a voice that was always cracking. She remembered him showing her a drawing he had done, a clumsy but earnest picture of a castle, and she had shown him some of her early sketches. It was a small, fragile connection, but it was real. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now he was Rohan, the popular guy, and she was Anya, the quiet girl with the sketchbook. The distance between them felt as wide as the Grand Canyon, lately. That distance had become a source of a quiet, strange torment for her. Rohan had developed a habit of singling her out, but never in a way that was obvious enough for anyone else to call him out on. It was always a joke. If he passed her in the hallway, he might say something like, "Hey, Anya, drawing any more pictures of your imaginary friends?" Just loud enough for his friends to snicker. Or he'd accidentally knock her books out of her hands, then offer a hand up with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. It was a constant, low-level hum of humiliation, designed to remind her of her place. It was his way of erasing the memory of the awkward boy with braces, of proving to himself and everyone else that he was nothing like that anymore. And she, with her quietness and her sketchbook, was the perfect reminder of a past he was desperate to leave behind. On stage, a girl finished singing a pop song, and the auditorium erupted in applause. The host, a drama teacher with too much energy, came bouncing back to the microphone. "That was fantastic. Give it up for Sarah," he yelled. The applause died down. "All right, we are going to take a quick 10-minute intermission. Stretch your legs, grab some snacks, and we'll be right back with more amazing talent." The lights came up a little, and the spell was broken. People started standing up, shuffling out into the lobby, and the low buzz of conversation returned. Anya took a deep breath, relieved for the break. She just wanted to go home. She closed her sketchbook, tucking her pencil carefully into its spiral binding. She was about to get up and leave, to just slip out the side door and walk home in the cool night air, when she felt it. That prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. She slowly turned her head, and her heart sank. Rohan wasn't looking at the stage or talking to his friends. He had turned completely around in his seat, and he was looking right at her. He was leaning towards his friends, a group of guys and girls who hung on his every word, and his lips were moving in a hushed, excited whisper. A wicked glint was in his eye, the kind she had seen before, right before he delivered one of his jokes. One of his friends looked over at her, then back at Rohan, and a cruel smile spread across his face. Then another friend looked, and another. Soon, his entire little group was turned around in their seats, looking at her and whispering stifling giggles behind their hands. Anya felt a wave of heat wash over her face. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was the topic of their conversation. She was the subject of their secret, mean-spirited fun. She quickly looked down at her hands, wishing she could disappear, wishing she had just left when she had the chance. She could feel their eyes on her, a heavy, suffocating weight. The 10-minute intermission had just begun, but she had a terrible feeling that the worst part of her night was yet to come. Rohan had a plan, and she was the unwilling star of it. The 10-minute intermission felt like it lasted for hours and was over in a second all at once. Anya remained glued to her seat, her sketchbook clutched to her chest like a shield. She could feel the eyes of Rohan and his friends on her, a constant prickly sensation that made her skin crawl. She wanted nothing more than to melt into the plastic chair, to become one with the sticky floor and just disappear. Every fiber of her being was screaming at her to get up, to push past the knees and feet of the people in her row and run out the side door into the cool, dark night. But she was frozen. It was like being in a nightmare where you're trying to run, but your legs are made of lead. The fear of drawing even more attention to herself by making a scene was just as powerful as the fear of what Rohan was planning. She was trapped. Slowly, the crowd began to drift back in from the lobby. The air grew thick again with the smell of popcorn and the low hum of 100 conversations. The lights dimmed, signaling that the show was about to start again. Anya's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet moment before the stage lights flared back to life. The host, Mr. Harrison, bounced back onto the stage, his smile wide and his energy artificially high. "Welcome back, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed the break. We have some fantastic acts left for you tonight, so get ready." He paused for the smattering of applause. "Now, our schedule is a little light, and we have a few extra minutes. So, I thought we could do something fun. Does anyone have a hidden talent they want to share? Come on, don't be shy." He scanned the crowd, his hopeful gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. A few people giggled and sank lower in their seats. No one volunteered. The silence stretched on for a moment, becoming slightly awkward. This was the moment. Anya saw it happen in slow motion. From the front row, a hand shot up. It was Rohan. He didn't just raise his hand. He stood up, a broad, disarming smile plastered on his face. He looked every bit the helpful, enthusiastic student. Mr. Harrison's face lit up with relief. "Yes, young man in the front? We have a volunteer." Rohan didn't wait to be called on properly. He cupped his hands around his mouth and boomed, his voice carrying easily through the quiet auditorium. "Mr. Harrison, I have a suggestion." A few people turned to look at him, intrigued. He had everyone's attention now. He pointed dramatically, not with a finger, but with a whole outstretched arm, towards the section where Anya was sitting. The spotlight operator, confused, followed his gesture. A bright, unforgiving circle of light landed right on Anya. She flinched as if she'd been struck, her eyes widening in terror. She was exposed. A gasp escaped her lips. "What about Anya?" Rohan continued, his voice dripping with a fake sincerity that was so thick it was almost sickening. She's always singing to herself in the library. I bet she has a voice like an angel. The last part was delivered with a slight, almost invisible curve of his lips, a look that his friends understood perfectly. A wave of laughter, not the kind that comes from genuine amusement, but the cruel, pack mentality kind, rippled through the students near him. It spread like a contagion, and soon a good portion of the auditorium was snickering. They weren't laughing with Rohan. They were laughing at her. At the idea of the quiet, weird girl with the sketchbook thinking she could sing, Anya's face felt like it was on fire. Her blood pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else. She could see the faces turned towards her, some curious, some laughing, some just blank. All of them were looking. All of them were judging. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing it all away. But it wasn't a dream. It was happening. Mr. Harrison, completely oblivious to the malicious undertone, beamed. He thought Rohan was being a kind, inclusive classmate. "Anya, what a wonderful idea," he chirped. "Come on down and let's hear that beautiful voice. Don't be shy." The pressure was immense. It was one thing to be called out by a cruel bully, but it was another thing entirely to be publicly invited by a teacher. To refuse now would make her seem difficult, rude. She would be confirming their idea that she was a weirdo who couldn't even take a compliment. She was cornered. Her mind raced, a frantic jumble of panicked thoughts. Asterisk, just say no. Shake your head. Mouth, no thank you. But her body wouldn't cooperate. Her legs felt like they were bolted to the floor. Her throat was so tight she couldn't have spoken even if she knew what to say. She could feel the tears welling up behind her eyes, and she fought them back with every ounce of her strength. She would not cry. She would not give him that satisfaction, from his throne in the front row. Rohan watched her, his plan unfolding perfectly. He loved this feeling, this power. He could see the conflict on her face, the terror and the humiliation. He leaned back in his squeaky chair, a look of triumphant satisfaction on his face. He had put her in an impossible position, and he was enjoying every second of her struggle. He expected her to stammer out a refusal, to maybe even burst into tears and run out of the auditorium. Either way, he won. He would have a funny story to tell tomorrow, another story that cemented his status at the top and her place at the bottom. But then, something shifted inside Anya. It wasn't courage. It wasn't strength. It was something closer to resignation. A cold, calm feeling settled in the pit of her stomach. She realized that running or refusing would only prolong the agony. The only way out was through. She had to walk through the fire. If she was going to be humiliated, she would do it on her own 2 feet. Slowly, mechanically, she unclenched her hands from her sketchbook and placed it on the empty seat beside her. She pushed herself up, her legs trembling slightly. The walk to the stage felt like a mile long. Every step was heavy, deliberate. The snickers seemed to get louder, the spotlight brighter. She kept her eyes fixed on the stage, on the single microphone standing there like a cold, metal monster. She didn't look at Rohan. She didn't look at the laughing faces. She just walked. She was no longer thinking, just moving. 1 foot in front of the other, a prisoner walking to her own execution, or maybe, just maybe, to something else entirely. She reached the stairs, her hand gripping the cool metal railing, and began her ascent to the brightly lit, terrifyingly empty stage. The wooden stairs leading up to the stage seemed to creak and groan with every step she took, each sound amplified in her own mind until it was as loud as a thunderclap. The world had shrunk to this small, steep climb. The bright lights were no longer just a glow. They were a physical force, hot and blinding, making it impossible to see anything beyond the first few rows of the audience. The snickers and whispers from before had faded into a dull, indistinct roar like the sound of a distant ocean. It was just her and the long, empty walk to the center of the stage. Her shoes felt sticky against the polished wooden floor, as if the stage itself was trying to hold her in place, to keep her trapped in this moment of humiliation. She could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, a heavy collective weight that pressed down on her shoulders. making her want to curl up into a ball and vanish. She finally reached the microphone stand. It was a simple, chrome-plated thing, but to her, it looked like a strange, alien creature waiting to devour her. Her hands trembled as she reached out to adjust its height, her fingers fumbling with the tightening screw. It was a small, pointless task, but it gave her something to do, something to focus on other than the terror that was threatening to swallow her whole. She could see her own distorted reflection in the round metal base of the stand, a pale, wide-eyed girl she barely recognized. She took a shaky breath, the air feeling thin and insufficient in her lungs from her new vantage point. The stage felt both enormous and terrifyingly small. She could see the faces in the front row more clearly now. There was Mr. Harrison, the drama teacher, beaming at her with an encouraging thumbs up, completely unaware of the cruel trap she had walked into. And there, a few seats down, was Rohan. He was leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph on his face. His smirk was a beacon of cruelty in the sea of faces. He had won. He had proven his point. He had dragged the quiet, weird girl onto the stage, and now everyone was waiting for her to crash and burn. He was savoring this moment, this public display of his power over her, a stagehand, a college-aged guy with a bored expression and a headset, gestured to her from the side of the stage. "What's the track?" he mouthed, holding up a clipboard. Anya's mind went completely blank. A track. A song. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't even thought about what she would sing. Her throat was dry, and her tongue felt like a thick piece of cotton. She was about to shake her head, to give up, to let the silence swallow her when a memory surfaced. It was a song her grandmother used to hum, a strange, old-fashioned melody from a country she had never visited. It was a song about quiet strength, about finding your voice when you thought you had none. It wasn't a pop song. It wasn't something anyone in this room would know. It was just hers. She leaned towards the stagehand, her voice barely a whisper. "The river's silence," she said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. The stagehand looked confused, scrolling through his tablet. "Never heard of it," he muttered. "Is it on Spotify?" Anya just shook her head, a sense of calm beginning to settle over her. It wasn't on Spotify. It was a song that lived only in her memory, a song she had taught herself to play on the small keyboard in her bedroom. "Just a simple piano melody," she whispered again. "C minor slow." The stagehand shrugged, clearly annoyed. But he scribbled a note on his clipboard and gave a thumbs up to the pianist. Sitting in the orchestra pit, Anya turned back to the microphone. Her heart still pounding, but with a different rhythm now. It was no longer the frantic beat of panic, but the heavy, determined thud of a drum. She wrapped her fingers around the cool metal of the microphone stand, grounding herself. The auditorium was silent now, the entire room holding its breath in anticipation. They were waiting for the joke. They were waiting for her to fail. She closed her eyes, shutting out the lights, the faces, the expectations. In the darkness behind her eyelids, it was just her and the memory of the melody. A single, clear piano note began to drift through the auditorium. It was a simple, haunting sound, full of a quiet sadness that seemed to absorb all the noise in the room. Another note followed, and then another, weaving a delicate, melancholic tapestry of sound. It was a song no one had ever heard, a melody that felt ancient and new all at once. Anya took a deep, slow breath, and when she opened her mouth to sing, her first note was exactly what everyone expected. It was shaky, thin, and barely a whisper. It cracked slightly under the pressure, and a few stifled giggles erupted from the front row. Rohan's smirk widened. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for, but then something changed. Anya didn't stop. She didn't flinch. She closed her eyes again, tighter this time, and she poured all of her pain, all of her loneliness, all of her quiet fury into the next note. And that note was different. It was no longer timid or weak. It was resonant, clear, and filled with a raw, powerful emotion that seemed to come from a place deep inside her, a place she had kept hidden for years. Her voice, no longer just a sound, became a story. It was the story of being invisible, of walking through hallways where no one sees you. It was the story of being used for someone else's amusement, of being the punchline to a joke you never agreed to be a part of. And then the melody shifted and her voice rose with it, telling a new story. It was a story about finding a quiet, unshakable strength in the face of cruelty, about realizing that your voice, even when it's just a whisper, has more power than 1,000 shouted insults. The entire auditorium was transfixed. The giggles had died instantly, replaced by a stunned, reverent silence. The song was not a performance. It was a confession. It was an act of defiance. And then Anya opened her eyes. She looked out, not at the blurry sea of faces, but directly at one person. She found Rohan in the front row, his triumphant smirk now gone, replaced by a look of dawning horror. She looked right at him, her gaze steady and clear. There was no anger in her eyes. There was no fear. There was only a deep, profound sadness, a look of pity. And in that moment, as her voice soared through the auditorium, filled with a pain and a strength he could never understand, Rohan knew he had made a terrible mistake. He hadn't just embarrassed her. He had handed her a microphone and given her a platform to expose the ugly emptiness of his own cruelty, and he was forced to listen to every single word. The first shaky note that escaped Anya's lips was exactly what Rohan had been waiting for. It was the sound of victory, the sweet, sweet sound of his plan working perfectly. He could feel a grin spreading across his face, a genuine, unforced smile of pure satisfaction. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, ready to soak in every second of her impending failure. This was better than he had imagined. The whole school was watching. The quiet girl, the weirdo with the sketchbook, was about to make a fool of herself on stage, and it was all because of him. He could already hear the stories he would tell tomorrow, the way he would mimic her trembling voice for his friends, the way they would all laugh and slap him on the back. He was the king, and this was his royal entertainment. But then the second note came. And the third. The shakiness was still there, but underneath it, there was something else. A current of strength, a hint of a power he hadn't expected. Her voice didn't crack again. Instead, it grew steadier, richer, filling the vast space of the auditorium with a sound that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The simple piano melody was no longer just background music. It was a foundation for a voice that was starting to sound less like a performance and more like a declaration. Rohan's smile faltered just for a moment. This wasn't part of the plan. She was supposed to stammer, to cry, to run off the stage. She wasn't supposed to actually be able to sing. As the song continued, the atmosphere in the room began to shift in a way Rohan could feel but couldn't yet understand. The low-level snickering that had been his soundtrack had completely died out. The restless shuffling and whispered conversations had ceased. A profound, heavy silence had fallen over the auditorium. The kind of silence that only happens when every single person in the room is completely captivated. He risked a glance at the people sitting around him. The girl who had been giggling beside him was now staring at the stage, her mouth slightly agape. The guy on his other side, who usually had a sarcastic comment for everything, was just watching, his expression unreadable. They weren't looking at him anymore. Their attention, and the attention of everyone else, was fully and completely on the girl on the stage. And then the lyrics of the song began to paint a painfully clear picture. He couldn't catch all the words, but certain phrases cut through the air like shards of glass. "A shadow in the hallway," she sang, her voice resonating with a quiet ache. A joke for a laughing crowd. Rohan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He looked back at the stage, at Anya. Her eyes were still closed, her face a mask of concentration and emotion. She wasn't just singing a song. She was living it. "You build your throne on someone's knees," another line went, and this time her voice swelled with a power that made the hairs on his arms stand up. "And you call it a game, but the price is their dreams." It was no longer a song. It was an indictment. And he was the one on trial. He felt the tide of the room turning against him. He could feel the collective consciousness of the audience connecting the dots. The cruel setup, the public call-out, the song about being used and humiliated. They were all looking at her, but they were thinking about him. He could feel their gazes shifting, subtly at first, then more overtly. A girl in the second row glanced from the stage to him, her eyes narrowed with a look of dawning disapproval. A guy a few seats down gave him a dirty look before turning his attention back to Anya, as if he couldn't bear to look at Rohan for more than a second. His friends, his loyal subjects, were silent. They weren't laughing anymore. They were staring at their shoes, at the ceiling, anywhere but at him. He was becoming an island, a pariah in his own kingdom, and then, the moment he had been dreading without even knowing it was coming. Anya opened her eyes, and she looked directly at him. The world seemed to slow down. The sea of faces blurred into the background, and all he could see was her. Her gaze was steady, clear, and unwavering. He braced himself for anger, for hatred, for a public shaming that would match his own. He was ready for her to be the villain, to expose him with a glare of pure fury. But that's not what he saw. There was no fire in her eyes. There was no rage. Instead, there was something far, far worse. There was pity. It was a look of profound, heart-wrenching sadness. It was the look someone gives a stray dog that's been kicked one too many times, or a child who doesn't understand why they're being punished. It was a look that said, "I see you, and I feel sorry for you." In that single look, she stripped him of all his power. He wasn't a king, a bully, or a threat. In her eyes, he was just a small, pathetic, insecure boy who needed to hurt others to feel big. The regret hit him then, not like a wave, but like a physical blow. It was a cold, sickening feeling that washed over him, starting in his chest and spreading to his limbs. He felt hot, then cold. The confident posture he had maintained all night slumped, his shoulders curling inwards as if he were trying to make himself smaller. To hide from her gaze, his mind raced, replaying every joke he had ever made at her expense. The time he accidentally knocked her books out of her hands in the crowded hallway. The time he announced to his lunch table that she was talking to her dragons again when she was just quietly drawing. All those little moments of cruelty that he had brushed off as harmless fun, as just how things are, now played back in his mind in high definition, amplified by the raw emotion of her voice. He saw them not as funny anecdotes, but as a series of small, deliberate acts of violence against her spirit. He had been chipping away at her, piece by piece, for his own amusement. And tonight he had asked her to hand him the hammer. And she had used it to break his own heart instead. Her voice soared through the final chorus of the song, a powerful, soaring melody that was both a cry of pain and a declaration of strength. And he just sat there, trapped in the spotlight of her pity, forced to listen to the story of his own cruelty sung back to him in the most beautiful voice he had ever heard. He had wanted to embarrass her, to make her feel small. But in doing so, he had given her the one thing he could never take back, a voice. And she was using it to tear down his entire world, not with anger, but with a grace and a strength that he knew he would never possess. The song wasn't just a performance anymore. It was his judgment. And as the final haunting piano note faded into the stunned silence of the auditorium, he knew he was guilty. The final haunting piano note faded into the air, and for a moment there was nothing. It was a complete and total silence, the kind that feels heavy and thick, pressing down on everyone in the room. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if Anya's voice had sucked all the sound out of the world, leaving only a raw, echoing emotion in its place. On the stage, Anya stood perfectly still, her hands still resting on the microphone stand, her eyes still fixed on Rohan. The single spotlight illuminated her, making her look like a statue carved from moonlight and sorrow. Then, a single person in the back row started to clap. It was a slow, deliberate sound at first, but it was quickly joined by another, and then another. Within seconds, the silence was shattered. The auditorium erupted. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a thunderous, deafening roar. People were on their feet, the entire room rising as one. The sound was a physical force, a wave of admiration and awe that crashed over the stage. They were cheering for her, not just for the beautiful song, but for the courage it took to sing it. They were cheering for the quiet girl who had found her voice and used it to speak for anyone who had ever felt Small or invisible, Anya finally broke her gaze from Rohan. She looked out at the sea of standing, cheering people, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. It wasn't a smile of victory or pride. It was a smile of quiet release. She gave a single, slow nod, not to the crowd, but in Rohan's direction. It was a final, silent acknowledgement, a closing of a chapter. Then she turned and walked off the stage, her head held high, her back straight. The walk down the stairs was the complete opposite of her walk up them. She was no longer a prisoner marching to her execution. She was a queen leaving her throne, her grace and dignity intact. For Rohan, the world had shrunk to the size of his plastic chair. The thunderous applause felt like a physical assault, each clap a hammer blow against his crumbling ego. He was a tiny island in a huge ocean of admiration for the girl he had tried to destroy. He remained slumped in his seat, his shoulders curled inward, unable to move, unable to even look up. He could feel the weight of the performance settling on him, not with the lightness of a beautiful memory, but with the crushing weight of a tombstone. He had wanted to make her the joke of the night, but he had become the villain of her story, and the entire audience was the jury that had just delivered its verdict. His friends were silent. The guy who had been snickering beside him was now staring intently at his phone, refusing to make eye contact. The girl who had laughed at his joke was now turned away, chatting animatedly with the person on her other side, as if trying to pretend she didn't know him. He was surrounded by people, but he had never felt more alone. The social armor he had so carefully constructed over the years had been shattered, and he was left exposed, raw, and pathetic. He could feel the eyes of the people around him, not with admiration, but with a mixture of pity and disgust. They were looking at him, the popular boy, the class president, and seeing him for what he really was, a bully dot. As the applause began to die down, Anya reached the bottom of the stairs. The moment her foot touched the floor of the auditorium, she was swarmed. A crowd of people, students she had never spoken to, rushed towards her. They weren't the popular kids or the drama club kids. They were just, people. That was incredible, a girl from her math class gushed. I had no idea you could sing like that. Where did you learn that song? Someone else asked. It was so beautiful. Anya, overwhelmed but calm, just smiled and accepted their compliments with a quiet thank you. Her invisibility had been shattered, replaced by a new kind of visibility, one built not on popularity or cruelty, but on talent and courage. Mr. Harrison, the host, finally made his way back to the microphone, his face beaming with a mixture of confusion and pride. Wow, just wow, he stammered. I think we can all agree that was unexpected. Let's give one more huge round of applause for Anya. The crowd roared again. And that's a wrap on this year's talent show. Good night, everyone. The house lights came up, flooding the auditorium with a harsh, bright light that felt like a spotlight on Rohan's shame. It was time to leave. He watched as Anya was led away by her new admirers, a small group forming around her as they headed towards the exit. She was in the center of the circle, laughing at something someone said. It was a real laugh, a sound he had never heard from her before. She looked happy. She looked free. He, on the other hand, had to pry himself out of his chair, his limbs feeling stiff and heavy. He kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the sticky floor as he joined the slow-moving stream of people heading for the doors. He could feel the stares, hear the whispers that were clearly about him. He walked out of the auditorium not like a king, but like a common criminal, shuffling through the crowd with his shame as a heavy cloak. The cool night air was a welcome relief against his hot, flushed skin. He didn't wait for his friends. He just started walking, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his backpack feeling like a ton of bricks on his shoulders. The walk home was a blur of streetlights and shadows, each one playing tricks on his mind. He kept replaying the night's events, but this time he saw it all through her eyes. He saw the cruel call-out, the laughing faces, the terrified walk to the stage. He felt a wave of nausea as he remembered his own smug satisfaction. He hadn't just been joking around. He had been deliberately, maliciously cruel. And for what? To get a few laughs? To feel powerful for a few minutes? He realized with a sickening certainty that his cruelty towards her had always been about himself. She was a living reminder of the awkward, insecure boy he used to be, the boy with the braces and the cracking voice who liked to draw castles. By tormenting her, by trying to erase her, he was trying to erase that part of himself. He had built his entire personality on a foundation of putting other people down, and tonight it had all come crashing down. She hadn't fought back with anger or insults. She had fought back with grace, with talent, with a truth so powerful it had leveled him completely. As he turned the corner onto his street, he saw her one last time. She was a block away, walking with a couple of girls from the talent show. They were laughing and talking, and for the first time, she looked like she belonged. She looked like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He stopped in the shadows of a large oak tree, watching her disappear down the street. He was alone, with only the cold, heavy weight of his regret for company. He had called her up to embarrass her, thinking it would be a funny story to tell. But now he knew it was a story he would never be able to tell, a memory that would haunt him for a long, long time. He hadn't just made a fool of himself. He had been forced to see the ugliest parts of his own soul, reflected back at him in the most beautiful voice he had ever heard.